We are honored to share our virtual pulpit on this evening with Reverend Dr. Janette Wilson. Reverend Wilson is the National Director of Push Excel, has been the Senior Advisor to Reverend Jesse Jackson, and has served Operation Push National Executive Director. She's a graduate of McMurray College. She has a Master of Science from Governor State University. She has a JD from John Marshall Law School and a Doctor of Divinity from United Theological Seminary. She is as well Senior Pastor of Metropolitan Apostolic Community Church. She is a tireless fighter for equality and justice. I have been honored to work in coalition with her, under her leadership, to try to build a better Chicago and a better, more just and equitable world. She is an inspiring leader who has built coalitions with other members of faith communities, clergy, and political leaders. It is our honor to welcome Reverend Dr. Wilson to our congregation.
First of all, let me thank Rabbi Gordon for this amazing opportunity to share with you this week as a part of your regular worship service. I thought it would be interesting as we've looked at the two pandemics, COVID-19 and the pandemic of violence that we've witnessed in our televisions and in our streets across America today. It appears that we're in a contest for equality with a Pharaoh who does not know God. And I would direct your attention to the book of Exodus. And in the 5th chapter of our Bible, verses 1 through 10, you will find in a translation these words. Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord Israel's God says, let my people go so that they can hold a festival for me in the desert." But Pharaoh said, "Who is this Lord whom I'm supposed to obey by letting Israel go? I don't know this Lord, and I certainly won't let Israel go." Then they said, "The Hebrews' God has appeared to us. Let us go on a 3-day journey in the desert so we can offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. Otherwise, the Lord will give us a deadly disease or violence." The king of Egypt said to them, "Moses and Aaron, why are you making the people slack off from their work? Do the hard work yourselves." Pharaoh continued, "The land's people are now numerous, but you want them to stop hard work?" On the very same day, Pharaoh commanded the people's slave masters and supervisors, "Don't supply the people with the straw they need to make brick like you did before. Let them go out and gather straw for themselves, but make sure they produce the same number of bricks they made before. Don't reduce the number. They're weak and lazy, and that's why they cry. Let's go offer sacrifices to our God. Make the men's work so hard that all they can do, they can't focus on these empty lies." So the people's slave masters and supervisors came out, spoke to the people. "This is what Pharaoh says, I'm not going to give you straw anymore." And so now as we look at this text, I know you wonder how this text applies to what you and I are witnessing as we watch the news or as we go to and fro from our stores, our trying to restore some sense of normalcy to our lives. Well, all of this is in the backdrop of the struggle. The people in the biblical times had engaged in a struggle for justice. They were being persecuted by the government, it seems. They had not been able to receive any relief from their hard work. No benefits were afforded to them. Just a continual level of struggle, which seemed to increase day by day. This text and the passages that continue mirror the struggle of African Americans for equality since we were brought to these shores as slaves in 1619 up until and including now. There's been a struggle for adequate housing, the struggle for unemployment, a struggle for access to a high quality, equal high quality public education, the access to capital so that there would be sustained wealth within our community. Last year marked the 400th anniversary of our journey on this side of the earth. And when we looked at the journey that African Americans have continued over these 400 years, there has been an increasing wealth gap between African Americans and white Americans. If you look at the level of savings that most African Americans don't have any savings. If they've been able to purchase a home, the mortgage rates were unusually high, the interest rates were enormous, and so there's never been a period for the majority of African Americans where they have been able to build wealth. Many could not start and own businesses because they had no access to capital. And so if you look back over our history, 1865, Emancipation Day, was supposed to be that moment when we were free from the impact of slavery, the legal impact, the legal institution of slavery, yet we were not free to own and manage the land that in many instances we received at the end of slavery. 8 generations after the emancipation, the racial wealth gap is continuing to increase. And it's about 1/10 for African Americans, it's about 1/10 of the wealth of typical white Americans. Black Americans by 1863 owned 0.5% of the national wealth in America. And so if you just look year after year, you think, well, maybe it's going to get better. The fact of the matter is, there is a decline in wealth as you look at it over time for African Americans. Even worse, while we've had some victories in the civil rights movement, we've had access to public accommodations, we've been able to elect people to office. We finally, in 1965, we get the Voting Rights Act. But when you look at our economic struggle and structures, they have systemically oppressed African American workers. Unionized African American workers were disproportionately vulnerable to the deindustrialization policies that were enacted in the 70s. And now you see a weakening of unions across the country as more and more African Americans have been pushed into leadership. Since the 1940s, African American farmers have been dispossessed of land across the South with the help of the government. So there's been a systemic pattern of discrimination and a decline for African Americans. You look at the housing crisis, it shows how African Americans were denied access to properties in areas that were growth areas. We were relegated to the poorer, less effective areas for housing. And so even though many African Americans earned significant income, they were pushed into communities with people who had significantly lower incomes. And so it was very difficult to get out of the poverty. Since the Great Recession, black workers have seen the lowest wage gains of any race in America. And so it is within this context that we must view the impact of COVID-19 and then these eruptions that have occurred, that are occurring in cities across America and in solidarity in countries around the world, because there's been this systemic oppression of a people. And so when you look at the economic oppression, and then you look at the abuses of African American males from the time we hit these shores up until now, the slave codes that resulted in the casual killing of African Americans with no prosecution of the murderer, who happened to be a white person. And you can trace this back 1739, enslaved Congolese warrior in South Carolina organized an uprising against whites. He was murdered. And in March 1770, Crispus Attucks, a black man, was killed, what was now called the Boston Massacre, but he was killed by the British when the British troops tried to police the colonists. And then you go from 1791, 1857, the Supreme Court decision in Dred Scott, where we are declared 3/5 of a human and having no rights, according to the Chief Justice Taney, that whites are to respect. And you just keep going year after year. Get to 1961, when the police commissioner Bull Connor in Birmingham, Alabama, along with the Ku Klux Klan, which we now call the alt-right, coordinated attack on the Freedom Riders and beat, firebomb, and hospitalized many of the peaceful protesters. Similar to what we are witnessing in some of the peaceful protests, people are infiltrating the protests and causing hostility and violence. And then you just keep going down from the 60s to the 70s and to the 90s. You would think by 1992, when Rodney King was beaten, you would think by then that the officers in Los Angeles, the 4 officers who beat Rodney King live on camera, just so happened a white journalist was there, they were acquitted. And so go past that, you finally get to 2012. Dante Servant shoots unarmed Rakia Boyd, acquitted of all charges. And then you go to 2014, Ferguson, Missouri. Officer Darren Wilson shoots and kills Mike Brown. Wilson was not charged with any criminal conduct, just in the course of duty. And so this pattern, this history of murder and disregard for the lives of black people, this pattern of systemic abuse has resulted in what we now see are uprisings, frustration and pain, the economic plight you see in the communities where the stores have been broken into and looted. I'm not justifying the looting, but it is a result of this systemic oppression. And so when oppressed people reach the boiling point, it is an uncontrolled passion. It is frustration that has just reached the point where it's unexplainable, and therefore it just is erupting in a showing of force and pain and anger, all bottled up. And I know you're saying, well, what should we do? Well, we must not lose hope. We certainly have to hold on to our faith. And I think that is why God has allowed us to witness a number of signs and things that cause us to pause. COVID-19 has slowed us down to allow the world to see America's injustice. It's not just a few African American leaders talking about it. They now see the impact of the racial injustice towards African Americans and people of color, but most specifically African Americans, and access to health care. And so you see COVID hitting us harder than any other race. We're dying and getting sicker quicker and faster because we have the pre-existing conditions that make it easy for the virus to attach itself to our bodies. When you look at the challenges students face with schools, COVID has indicated the educational inequities that exist. Our students don't have access to the technology, the broadband, and so now they're further behind because we've been doing distance education. And you look at the Native Americans on reservations, similarly, they have no access to the kind of technology that will allow them to continue to learn in this environment of COVID. You wouldn't know that, but until God exposed through COVID all of these inequities. You don't know how many people are vulnerable and first responders until we've watched COVID and people die in nursing homes because the workers in the nursing homes can't take sick time, so even when they're ill, they have to go to work and they've not been given proper PPE protections. But we still must hold on to our faith. We must now recognize there is a power greater than any person. We must not compromise our morals during this season. We must make sure that we are prepared as a people of faith. Whatever tradition we have, we must know that we are called by God to seek the peace. We are to fight to make sure that the government that we live in practices justice and righteousness and mercy to everyone. We must not allow ourselves to be separated by culture and economic status. We must know that together we can make the government just for all. We must demand justice for the poor and make sure that we deliver to the needy. We now know the vast numbers of people who are hungry, homeless, and needy as we watch the lines of people standing for food. We must sacrifice what we have to make sure that the have-nots are gaining and surviving and being sustained. We must work steadfastly within this political system that we provide our laws provide for the least among us. And so when we look at the CARES Act, we must make sure that every senator is pushed to pass the next stimulus package that will reach down and lift those up who have been unemployed and unemployment benefits have run out, who have no ability to have food for their families. We must be the peacemakers. And peace is not the absence of noise. It is, in fact, the presence of justice. We must unite together. African Americans, Jews, Native Americans, those who have understood this journey and this struggle to fight oppression, to fight those who would deny our humanity. We have similar journeys, and so as we unite across our lines of common ground, we can change the system. We have the power. We have, and both of us serve a God of justice, a God who requires us to speak truth to power. And so I pray that God will give us the conviction, the courage to elect a government, not just an office, a government that prioritizes the least of these. We need someone at every level of government, from the White House to the State House to the City House, that cares about the least of these. And I believe that all of these pandemics that we now face are God's way of getting our attention, God's way of refocusing the people of faith, that we might do the will of the God that sent us, the God that has placed us at this moment in time. And so I know that there is hope beyond this moment, because our God has not left us. He's not forsaken us. God is still with us. God bless you. God keep you.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do shall